Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Today's episode will be my top 5 tight ends. Before we jump in today, please make sure you follow me right here on Spotify, as well as on Instagram at Wedge 52 Gridiron. And do me a favor and rate the podcast, as well as listen to a couple episodes. I've done a bunch of 10-minute reports, as well as a couple other episodes prior to those. So now I'll be doing my top 5s. This episode will be top 5 tight ends. Stuff to look forward to is top 5 running backs, wide receivers, and quarterbacks. Those will be dropping, in the coming weeks, one episode per Tuesday. So kind of a little bit of what I'm taking into consideration in my rankings is for each player, last year's stats, their previous 3-year stats, as well as last season highs. So, their highest in the couple categories I'm looking at for last year. And then also the other weapons that they were playing alongside, kind of some other pieces that were on the same offense as them, or on the same offense for, one or two out of those 3 seasons maybe, or all 3. And then kind of the last thing is just kind of the eye test or play style test, kind of how much their eyes, make your eyes open wide and things like that. So with all of that being said, let's start jumping into my top 5 tight ends in the NFL. Coming in at 5th place is tight end Dalton Schultz. This year will be his first year on the Texans after spending the previous 5 years as a Dallas Cowboy. Last season, Dalton, he had 57 receptions, 577 yards, and 5 touchdowns for the Cowboys. And then in his last 3 years, he's had 198 receptions, 2,000 yards, and 17 touchdowns. His season highs last year was 7 receptions for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns. Those numbers, all 3 of those did not come from the same game. But last year that would have been his maximum. 7 catches for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns. Not bad. And then some other weapons that the Cowboys have had during when Schultz was there include CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, as well as others. But those were the most notable names. So for Schultz to be able to put up 2,000 yards and 17 touchdowns in the last season, really being a number 3 option at best. Definitely CeeDee Lamb has been the number 1 option since he's been in the league for the Cowboys. And then Amari Cooper, I would say most of the time was the number 2 option in the seasons that he was a Cowboy. So Schultz being a second or most likely a third option in that offense on passing plays. Pretty impressive numbers for him. Gets Dalton Schultz ranked as the 5th tight end on my list. And we will see what he does in the new offense down in Houston. I guess it's not really down Dallas to Houston, it's obviously both in Texas. But new offense for him. A new quarterback will now have C.J. Stroud. The past few years, he's had Dak Prescott and fire-up chips Cooper Rush. So we'll see if he's able to stay in that top 5, 5th place ranking. Before we get any further, I would like to just note a honorable mention real quick. I'll not be going over all of their stats, but honorable mention, Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles. He just missed the cut. With the last 3 seasons, he has 157 receptions, 2,056 yards, and 10 touchdowns. So he just missed the cut. And now moving on to my fourth best tight end in the NFL on my list is now Vikings tight end TJ Hockenson. TJ Hockenson is kind of one, in my opinion, potentially underrated as a tight end. You don't hear his name come up as often or as quick in the top tight ends conversation, but his numbers are much closer to the big three tight ends that I'm sure all of you are thinking of than, he kind of gets credit for. So last season, TJ Hockenson, over the course of two teams, the Lions and the Vikings, of course, he got traded from the Lions before that trade deadline in the 2022 season. The Lions believed that either A, they wouldn't be able to afford Hockenson, or B, that Hockenson would no longer want to play there, and decided to trade him to get some sort of value rather than letting him walk in what would have been free agency this offseason. So last year, TJ Hockenson had 86 receptions, 914 yards, and 6 touchdowns over the two teams, the Lions and the Vikings. In the past 3 seasons, TJ Hockenson has had 214 receptions, 2,220 yards, and 16 touchdowns. Again, majority of that came from his time as a Lion, but he did still produce very well with the Vikings, and I would expect the same thing to happen again in this upcoming 2023 season. Last season's highs for TJ Hockenson, 13 receptions, 179 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So these are actually very good highs, and I believe rank in the highest for receptions and yards in terms of season game highs in a season. On this list, the only one he didn't take the cake on was touchdowns, which belongs to someone that we will talk about later. But 13 catches for 179 yards and 2 touchdowns, if that all happened in one game, would be ridiculous numbers. So definitely helped TJ Hockenson get on this list. And then some of the other Lions and Vikings weapons that he has had throughout the past 3 years. With the Lions, he had Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then Hockenson was probably number 2. He was playing with other guys like Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds, I believe. So Hawk being a number 2 target guy on the Lions the past few years has definitely led to his production. But then he got traded to the Vikings, who obviously have Justin Jefferson, one of the best. He will definitely be high on the top 5 wide receivers list. Make sure you guys tune into that episode later. But TJ Hockenson has played with Justin Jefferson, as well as Adam Thielen was a Viking last season. So TJ Hockenson is able to make very good contested catches. Seems like he is reliable on third downs. TJ Hockenson has earned himself the 4th ranking on my top 5 tight ends list. Now moving on to the 3rd best tight end, in my opinion, my 3rd top tight end in the NFL, George Kittle from the 49ers. Last year, George Kittle, as a Niner, had 60 receptions, 765 yards, and 11 touchdowns, as well as last season he was All-Pro second team. In the previous 3 years combined, George Kittle has 179 receptions, 2,309 yards, and 19 touchdowns. And then that AP second team All-Pro selection from last season. His season highs last year were 8 receptions, 120 yards, and 2 touchdowns. would have been a solid performance by any tight end, of course. So these all have contributed to George Kittle being that third best tight end on my list. Some of the other weapons that he's played with, he's been in more of a, systemal, that offense, 49ers offense. Shanahan's offense has always been, very efficient, very mapped out kind of thing. Puts them in the best chances to have high success rates, no matter who is at quarterback, who they've had several, especially last season, enter the game. But some of the other weapons that Kittle has played alongside include Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, as well as Mohamed Sanu. And even with Deebo being their top wide receiver, one of the better receivers in the league, George Kittle has still been, right there, if not, the main or primary target getter in terms of their offensive weapons. George Kittle is also very solid in the run blocking game. And these things contributed to him being third on my list for top 5 tight ends. And George Kittle also has been very consistent with his production. 179 receptions divided by 3 is just about 60 receptions a year, which he had last year, as well as the 2,309 yards divided by 3 again is, about 770-ish, I want to say, which he had 765 yards last season. And then the one that kind of slips a little is the 19 touchdowns in 3 years, with 11 of them coming last season. But George Kittle definitely went up top third best tight end in the NFL. Moving on to the second best tight end in the NFL, in my opinion, has got to be none other than Money Mark Andrews for the Baltimore Ravens. Last season, Mark Andrews had 73 receptions, 847 yards, and 5 touchdowns in what felt like a down year for Mark Andrews last season. Of course, let me talk about that with the other weapons portion of the Mark Andrews. But last 3 seasons, Mark Andrews has had 238 receptions, 2,909 yards, and 21 touchdowns, as well as 1 first-team All-Pro within the previous 3 seasons. His single-game highs for last season would be 9 receptions, 106 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And then kind of, what helps, I think, a lot of people, the biggest debate out of the big 3 comes between Andrews and Kittle for that 2 and 3 spot. And I'm going to tell you why Mark Andrews takes number 2 for me. The Ravens' other weapons throughout the past 3 years for Mark Andrews include Hollywood Brown, injured most of the time, or about half the time, injured, Rashad Bateman, Devin Duvernay, and, Sammy Watkins. Hollywood's was gone this season, which probably led to more intentional double teams for our defenses for Mark Andrews. And he was still, able to put up 850 yards, 5 touchdowns as he learned to adjust through that. But even before then, the Ravens have not really had a serious threat at the wide receiver position except for Hollywood Brown and Mark Andrews. It's still considered a down year for Mark Andrews with 847 yards and 5 touchdowns. The Ravens the past 3 years with Greg Roman's offensive scheme was definitely a run-first offense, and Andrews still being able to put up these kind of numbers is, pretty remarkable. So that's why I put him at number 2 over George Kittle, is because of the offensive scheme and the lack of weapons and, other players around Mark Andrews in the receiving game the past 3 years. Mark Andrews also makes incredible catches all the time, going over defenders, muscling the ball down. He's able to get open, and find a seam to take a ball to the end zone after the catch, as well as he's made some very good contested catches, like the one in the back of the end zone last season against, I'm forgetting at the moment, or the catch in the back of the end zone. First, catching it over the defender against the Cleveland Browns, I believe 2 years ago, and then 2 plays later, catching the sliding touchdown pass from Lamar Jackson a couple plays later. So Mark Andrews, to me, opens up the eyes from his miraculous plays more than George Kittle, as well as puts up equal or slightly better over the past 3 years, 50 more, 60 more receptions almost, 600 more yards, and a couple more touchdowns in the past 3 years, coming from a run-first offense. Mark Andrews is my second best tight end in the NFL. Now leading into the best tight end in the NFL. This one I'm sure comes as no shocker for any football fan, but my best tight end in the NFL, I have ranked first, is Travis Kelce from the Kansas City Chiefs. Last year, Kelce had 110 receptions, 1,338 yards, and 12 touchdowns to go along with a first-team All-Pro selection. Over the last 3 years, Kelce has had 307 receptions, 3,879 yards, and 32 touchdowns to go along with one second-team All-Pro selection, and 2 first-team All-Pro selections. So Kelce obviously is, no pun intended, but yards ahead of, even Mark Andrews at number 2, with, almost 70 more receptions in the past 3 years, almost 1,000 more yards the past 3 years, and 11 more touchdowns over the past 3 years. Last season's single-game highs for Travis Kelce would be 10 receptions, 115 yards, as well as 4 touchdowns in one game he had, which was kind of crazy. I believe he had like 4 or 5 catches for 24 yards and 4 touchdowns that game. So he's got a knack for finding the end zone, of course. And some of the other weapons that he, has played alongside the past few years. Tyreek Hill, of course. Mecole Hardman, Pringle, Demarcus Robinson. Those are some of the players he's played against. When Tyreek Hill was there, who, is going to be on my top 5 wide receivers list. When that comes out in a couple of weeks, when Tyreek Hill was there, Travis Kelce was still arguably, or flip-flopped every game with Tyreek for who you could say was the number 1 wide receiver. So for Travis Kelce to be able to, go neck and neck with one of the best receivers in the league is pretty incredible. And then Tyreek Hill got traded to the Dolphins last offseason. And, there was kind of some curiosity and some naysayers about the Chiefs' offense and how that was going to function, and the success rates of Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce in that offense. And the Chiefs, did not have Tyreek Hill, which probably meant more double teams, more intentional double teams for Travis Kelce. And he was still able to put up, crazy numbers, over 1,300 yards, over 100 receptions, 12 touchdowns, first team All-Pro. Combination of all of that makes Travis Kelce the best tight end in the NFL. And that wraps up my top 5 tight ends in the NFL ranking. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Please make sure you check out some of my other episodes I've been created, as well as press that follow button so you guys can see and be updated when the top 5 rankings for other positions come out. Thank you all for listening once again, and go Ravens.